Most people who receive a terminal diagnosis spend the time they have left trying to hold on to what they had. But Walter White did the opposite. He let go of everything he had been and became everything he had been pretending not to be. And here's one of my favorite things about Walter White that makes such a good case file for Season 2, is that he wasn't transformed by a cancer diagnosis. He was revealed by it. The cancer did not create Heisenberg, it just gave Walter White permission to introduce him. His name was Walter Hartwell White, a high school chemistry teacher, car wash employee, husband, father. And the most dangerous thing about him? It was never the methamphetamine. It was the man he had been quietly becoming for 20 years before anyone even noticed. Welcome back, everybody, to Dark Margins. My name's Bobby Garrison. This is Season 2, and I want to take a moment to look at the pattern we've been building. Bruce Wayne was our first case file, and he unfortunately watched his parents die and then built an obsession with never being powerless again. Anakin Skywalker watched his mother die in his arms and built an obsession with never losing anyone he ever loved again. And so obviously both of them were responding to a wound that arrived from outside, something that happened to them, and the obsession grew from that. But Walter White is different. Walter White's wound didn't arrive from outside, it was self-inflicted, or more precisely, it was inflicted by a choice he made 20 years before the show begins. A choice he has never fully admitted to himself, and a wound he's been carrying in silence ever since. And that distinction between a wound that was done to you and a wound you participated in makes Walter White one of our favorite cases in Dark Margins. Because it's very easy to understand Bruce Wayne, and it's also very easy to understand Anakin Skywalker, but Walter White is harder, because Walter White's not a man who was broken by tragedy. He's a man who was diminished slowly, quietly, over decades by nothing more than mediocrity. And the obsession that destroyed him didn't begin with cancer. It began in a laboratory in California with a company called Gray Matter Technologies. And also a decision he made when he was young and brilliant and had everything ahead of him. So, that's where we start. Before there was Heisenberg, before there was meth or Gus Fring or the desert or any of it, there was a young man named Walter White who was genuinely exceptional. And not moderately talented, not just barely above average. I'm telling you, he was exceptional. A chemist of real brilliance. He had the kind of mind that comes along very rarely, the kind of student that professors remember decades later. And with his friend Elliot Schwartz and his girlfriend Gretchen, Walter co-founded a company called Gray Matter Technology, a company that would eventually be worth billions of dollars. And then Walter left. And if you've seen the show, you know it's deliberately vague about exactly why he left. The story shifts depending on who's telling it. Walter says he was pushed out. Elliot says Walter walked away. The truth, like most painful truths, is probably somewhere in the middle and doesn't fully exonerate either of them. But here's what's not vague. Walter White left Gray Matter Technologies for a settlement of $5,000. Meanwhile, Elliot and Gretchen kept building the company, and then Gray Matter became worth $2.16 billion. Let's say that one more time. $2.16 billion. Now, there was a part in Season 1 where we talked about empathy. Think about what that does to a person. We talked about it with Monte Cristo, we talked about it with Medea, and we kind of left that in Season 2, but let's get back to that. Think about what that does to a person over 20 years. Not the money's almost beside the point. What it does to a person to watch something they build, something that came from their mind, their work, their brilliance, become extraordinary without them. to watch the life they should have had being lived by someone else. Every time gray matter appeared on television, or every time Elliot and Gretchen were photographed at a charity gala, or every time Walter saw the company name, the wound was then opened again. And Walter did what most people do with wounds they can't talk about. He buried it. He went to work, he taught chemistry to teenagers who didn't care about chemistry, and he worked a second job at a car wash. He also drove a broken-down Pontiac Aztek. He lived in a house that was too small for the size of the life he had imagined for himself. And he told himself it was fine. But underneath all of that, underneath the reasonable husband and the dedicated teacher and the man who showed up every day and did what was expected, was a man who believed he deserved more. Who knew he was smarter than his circumstances suggested, who had watched his potential evaporate into someone else's success, and who had never, not once in 20 years, allowed himself to fully feel how much that cost him. Now, here's what psychology tells us about buried wounds. Roy Baumeister, one of the most important social psychologists of the last 50 years, spent decades studying what happens to highly intelligent people when their self-image is threatened. His research on narcissistic injury, the specific psychology damage done when a person who believes they were exceptional and are just treated as ordinary, found something that explains Walter White almost perfectly. When a person with a strong belief in their own exceptionalism is consistently denied the recognition they believe they deserve, the wound does not produce humility. It actually produces rage. And it's not just a blown out of proportion rage. It's a quiet rage, a controlled rage, a rage that gets up and goes to work and grades papers and smiles at parent-teacher conferences. But it's still rage nonetheless. And like a lot of different emotions, rage needs somewhere to go. And for Walter White, the cancer he was diagnosed with gave that rage a direction. Now let's go to September 7th. It's Walter White's 50th birthday. His family throws him a surprise party he clearly doesn't want, and his brother-in-law, Hank, dominates the room the way Hank always dominates rooms. His wife, Skylar's pregnant. His son has cerebral palsy. The mortgage is behind. And then Walter collapses at the car wash. A few days later, a doctor uses the word inoperable. It's lung cancer. It's terminal. He has possibly 2 years left. And here's the conversational reading of what happens next. A desperate man, faced with his own mortality and his family's financial future, makes a terrible choice. He cooks methamphetamine to leave his family money before he dies. If you think about it, if you really want the empathy part of it, he's driven by love, by desperation, by the impossible situation of a good man in a bad corner. The reading is what Walter White wants you to believe. It's what Walter White wants himself to believe. But watch the show again. Watch it carefully this time. Watch Walter White in the first episode when he puts on the gas mask in the desert. Watch his face. You'll notice that's not the face of a desperate man doing something he hates. That's the face of a man who's just remembered who he is. Watch Walter White the first time he watches his product being tested, when he's told it's the purest methamphetamine anyone's ever seen. That's not relief. That's not knowing that his family's future's secure and that's why he did it. No, that's none of that. That face that he has, it's pride. So think about this. The cancer didn't create Heisenberg. The cancer created the conditions under which Walter White finally felt justified in introducing Heisenberg. Because here's what the terminal diagnosis actually gave Walter White. It gave him permission. Permission to stop performing the version of himself that the world expected. Permission to stop being reasonable and responsible and careful and small. It gave him permission to stop pretending that teaching high school chemistry to students who fell asleep in his class was enough for a man of his intelligence. So when Walter White heard that diagnosis, all he thought was, finally. Now let's be clear about something. This doesn't mean Walter White wasn't afraid. He was. This doesn't mean the financial pressure wasn't real. It was. But fear and permission can exist simultaneously. And what the show makes clear, slowly, carefully, and across 5 seasons, is that the financial justification was always a story Walter White told himself. The reason was simpler and darker and more human than that. Walter White cooked methamphetamine because he was exceptional at it, because it made him feel powerful, because, for the first time since gray matter, he was the best at something again. Now, I know there's a few of you out here that are going, oh man, I hope he talks about it, I hope he talks about it, and I hope this is where you're thinking. Let's talk about the hat. The black pork pie hat that Walter White puts on partway through the first season, because the hat's not a costume choice. It's actually a declaration. Walter White doesn't become Heisenberg gradually without knowing it. There's a moment, and it's a specific conscious moment, where Walter White decides to become someone else. And the hat is the announcement. Now, Erik Erikson, whose work on identity we've discussed in the Bruce Wayne episode, wrote about what he called the negative identity. The self that forms not from what the person aspires to be, but from everything they've been told they're not. Walter White spent 20 years being told by circumstances or by outcomes or by the simple math of his life that he was not exceptional, that he wasn't powerful, and that he wasn't the kind of man whose name anyone would remember. Heisenberg is the negative identity made flesh. Heisenberg is everything Walter White was told he couldn't be. Feared, respected, powerful, dangerous, the kind of man who walks into a room and changes the temperature of it. And here's where Robert Vallerand's research on obsessive passion enters the story. Vallerand found that obsessive passion, the kind that consumes rather than enhances, typically begins when a person's self-worth becomes entirely dependent on one activity, when they can't separate who they are from what they do. For Walter White, Heisenberg's not something he does. Heisenberg's the first version of himself he's fully truly believed in since he was 20 years old at a laboratory in California. And that total identification with the obsession is what makes it impossible to walk away. And think about this for just a second, because we know that he could have got out. Skylar offers him a way out. The DEA offers him a way out. Circumstances offer him a way out. Multiple times across 5 seasons, there were plenty of moments where Walter White could have walked away. And every time he could have walked away, he did the opposite. He chose the obsession. Not because he was trapped, because he didn't want to go back to being Walter White. Because Walter White was the man who watched gray matter become $2.16 billion without him. Walter White was the man who taught bored teenagers in a school that barely paid him. And Walter White was the man whose brother-in-law told embarrassing stories about him at parties. Heisenberg, however, was the man who made the cartel afraid. And once you've been Heisenberg, once you've felt what it feels like to walk into a room and have everyone in it understand that you are the most dangerous person there, well, Walter White's not a step down. Walter White is a kind of death. Now, there's this scene in Season 1 of Breaking Bad that I think's the precise moment Walter White becomes Heisenberg permanently. It's this moment he walks into Tuco Salamanca's territory. He has HgCnO2. It's mercury fulminate, and he detonates it. Now, if you've seen it, you know that Tuco's one of the most violent and unpredictable figures in the Albuquerque drug trade. He's beaten people to death, he's erratic and dangerous, and nobody walks into his territory alone and survives. But Walter White walks in alone with a bag, and he blows up half the building. And then, in the ringing silence after the explosion, he delivers the feeling behind the line that tells you everything you need to know about where this story's going. And you can watch Walter White's face in that moment. And it's not the face of a man who's scared or desperate. It's the face of a man who's experienced something he's never experienced before. It's the face of being feared. And it feels extraordinary to him. Let's head back to psychology for a bit. There's this piece called terror management theory. It was developed by Jeff Greenberg and Sheldon Solomon and Tom Pazinski. It tells us about what happens to human behavior when mortality becomes real. And the research found that awareness of death doesn't make people humble, it makes people desperate to matter. It makes them desperate to leave something behind or desperate to feel significant before the lights go out. Most people respond to that desperation by doubling down on the things that already give them meaning: family, faith, legacy. Walter White responded to it by finally allowing himself to pursue the thing he had suppressed for 20 years, and that one little piece was significance. We all know that the cancer told him he was going to die. And some part of Walter White decided, if I am going to die, I'm not going to die as a man nobody noticed. I'm going to die as the man everyone was afraid of. Well, that's not necessarily courage or desperation. It's pride. It's the dark, consuming 20-year pride that finally gives permission to breathe. Now let's take just a brief moment and go over the story Walter White told himself, because it's the most important part of the psychology. Walter White told himself that he was doing it for his family, for Skylar, for Walt Jr., for the baby, and that was to leave them something after he was gone, to make sure they were provided for. And I guess for a while, maybe for the first few episodes, the story was partially true. But you can watch that change a little bit. It happens over 5 whole seasons. You see that the money accumulates past any reasonable amount his family could possibly need. The business expands past any logical justification, and the violence escalates past any defensible necessity. But instead of stopping, Walter White just keeps on going. And we can see that it's not because the family needs more money or because cancer demands more treatment. And it's not because any external circumstance requires more. It's because Heisenberg himself requires more. It's because the obsession, once it has its hands around the self, it doesn't know how to stop. Now, there's a saying, and it's old as the church itself. It's been attributed to pastors and theologians for generations, and it's simply, sin will take you farther than you wanted to go, it'll cost you more than you wanted to pay, and it'll keep you longer than you wanted to stay. Now, I'm not here to make a theological argument today, but I wanted you to notice something about that saying. And that's that you can replace that word sin with either compromise or obsession. And so, as we get back to the story, we see Walter White wanted to cook enough methamphetamine to leave his family secure, but the obsession took him farther than that. It cost him more than that, and it kept him longer than that. Every single time he tried to stop, the obsession had already moved to the finish line, which is exactly what Vallerand's research on obsessive passion confirms. And the research on obsessive passion found that one of its defining characteristics is the inability to disengage. even when disengagement's rational or available, even when the person inside the obsession can see clearly with their own eyes that continuing is causing more damage than stopping would. Walter White could see it. He watched his marriage collapse. He watched Jesse deteriorate. He watched his brother-in-law start to suspect. And he watched his son look at him differently. But he kept cooking, because stopping meant going back, and going back meant being Walter White again. And Walter White, the real Walter White, the one who existed before the hat and the alias and the blue methamphetamine, was the man he had spent 20 years trying to escape. Now here's the moment in the finale that tells you everything. Walter White's dying, the cancer's returned. He has hours left. And Skylar asks him, finally, directly, was any of it for us? And Walter White, for the first and only time in 5 seasons, tells the truth. I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive. That word, alive. 20 years of a beige life. 20 years of watching gray matter become billions without him. 20 years of being the man nobody feared, nobody noticed, or nobody remembered. And then he got 2 years of Heisenberg, 2 years of being the most feared man in the Southwest, 2 years of walking into rooms and watching them change. And the word he uses for those 2 years, for all the destruction and the death and the collateral damage, was alive. That's not a villain's confession. That's a human being finally telling the truth about what the obsession gave him and what it cost him to get it. Let's look at what Walter White actually left behind, though. Not what he intended to leave behind, what he actually left. His wife, a woman who once loved him, spent the final years of his life afraid of him. And not just, disappointed or angry. She was terrified. His son, who idolized him, found out who his father actually was, and the last thing Walt Jr. said to his father on the phone was, "Just die." His brother-in-law, who irritated him, who told embarrassing stories at parties, who Walter secretly resented for the easy confidence Walter himself never had, died because of choices Walter made. And then there was Jesse Pinkman, the student Walter recruited, the young man who trusted him, the person who called him Mr. White like it meant something, was left traumatized and broken. And then the money, the $9 million he arranged to be sent to his family. Skylar turned it away, because accepting it meant explaining where it came from. Walter White cooked methamphetamines for 2 years. He destroyed his family, his health, his relationships, his brother-in-law, his former student. He poisoned a child. He watched a woman choke to death and didn't call for help. He ordered murders. He committed murders. And at the end, his family had nothing. His son wanted him dead. His wife lived in a cramped apartment, afraid of her own phone. The obsession consumed everything it touched, including the man who started it. Because here's the final cost that most analyses miss. Walter White wanted to feel exceptional. He wanted to matter. He wanted to be the man no one could ignore. At the end, he was alone in a cabin in New Hampshire with a barrel of money he couldn't spend and a name nobody even used anymore. Heisenberg got everything Walter White wanted and left Walter White with nothing. And that's what obsession with power does. It delivers the thing you asked for and destroys the person who asked. So, here's where Dark Margins lands on Walter White. The obsession with power destroyed the man who started it, but I want to be precise about something. Because it would be easy and wrong to say that the obsession destroyed Walter White from outside. The obsession didn't attack Walter White. It grew from deep inside him, from the gray matter wound, from 20 years of suppressed rage. from the cancer that finally said, "You have nothing left to lose." Walter White didn't become Heisenberg despite who he was. He became Heisenberg because of who he was. If you get back to Roy Baumeister's research, it tells us that the most dangerous form of wounded pride is the kind that's been waiting. Not the pride that explodes immediately when injured, but the pride that sits quietly for 20 years, that shows up for work and grades papers and smiles at the right moments. And during all those right moments, it just waits. It's the kind of pride that doesn't need much to become dangerous. It just needs permission. The cancer Walter White was diagnosed with was the permission. And here's what I want you to sit with today. Because this episode, more than any other episode Dark Margins has made, is about something most of us are closer to than we want to admit. Most of us have a version of gray matter somewhere in our past, something we built that someone else profited from, something we were exceptional at that the world never fully acknowledged. There's some version of our potential that looked at us through a window from the other side of a choice we couldn't take back. And most of us have learned to live with it, to do what Walter White did for the first 20 years, show up, perform the reasonable version of ourselves, tell ourselves it's fine. And the question Walter White's story asks, the one that keeps this show relevant long after it ended, is whether the thing we buried is still alive in there. Whether the gray matter wound is still open, whether the 20 years of quiet rage is still waiting, whether somewhere underneath the reasonable life there's a version of ourselves that would recognize what Walter White felt like in the moment with Tuco, when he was finally feared. I'm not saying the answer is yes, and I'm not saying we would make the same choices, but I'm saying the question deserves an honest answer. Because the difference between Walter White and most people isn't that he had the wound and we didn't. It's that he was given permission and he took it. The obsession that grew from that permission didn't make him exceptional. It made him alone. I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive. He was alive for 2 years, and it cost him everything that was worth living for. That's the verdict on Walter White. The obsession delivered what it promised and left nothing worth having behind. So let's get into the case file. We went over this in Bruce Wayne and Anakin Skywalker. This is about Walter White. We'll go over the wound, the promise, the obsession, the shadow, the cost, and finally the verdict. So the wound was Gray Matters Technology, the company he co-founded that became worth $2.16 billion without him. 20 years of watching his potential be lived by someone else. The specific unspoken word of a man who knew he was exceptional and was treated as ordinary, and never fully allowed himself to feel how much that cost. Then there was the promise. It was never spoken out loud. It wasn't even fully conscious. But underneath the fear and the shock of the diagnosis was a quiet decision. If I'm gonna die, I'm not gonna die as the man nobody noticed. I'm gonna matter, and I'm gonna be the one who knocks. And now we get into the obsession. It was power disguised as provision, significance disguised as sacrifice. It was the need to be exceptional at something and to be feared and respected that had been suppressed for 20 years. Heisenberg wasn't a character Walter White created. He was the person Walter White had been all along, finally given permission to exist. The shadow? Heisenberg. The identity that grew so large it consumed the man who created it. Walter White didn't lose himself to Heisenberg gradually. He surrendered himself willingly. Because going back to Walter White meant going back to the man Gray Matter left behind. Now, what was the cost? Quite a bit. His wife lived in fear, his son told him to die, his brother-in-law died because of him, his student was broken, his family had nothing, and Walter White, the most feared man in the Southwest, died alone on a meth lab floor. He delivered everything the obsession promised, and he lost everything that made the delivery worth anything. So what's the verdict? He said, I did it for me, I liked it, I was good at it, and I was alive. Now, that's probably the most honest thing Walter White had ever said. The obsession with power delivered what it promised and it destroyed the man who asked for it. Not from outside, but from within. Now, if you don't know about Breaking Bad, there's 5 seasons of it and it's on Netflix. If you haven't watched it, I suggest you do watch it, and if you have watched it, watch it again with this framework in your mind. Watch for the moments Walter White chooses Heisenberg when he could have chosen differently. Watch his face when he's feared. Ask yourself whether the show's about a man who became a monster or a man who finally stopped pretending he wasn't one. And then come back next week on Dark Margins, because we leave the desert and go to a palace. A man who spent his entire life refusing to become his father and actually became something worse. He didn't want the family business, he actually wanted out. He was the good son, the war hero, the one who was supposed to be different. And he became ruthless. He became the greatest his family had ever seen, and not because the power corrupted him, but because the obsession with protecting what he loved made him willing to destroy everything else. And if you haven't, subscribe to this channel, because the next episode, the most dangerous obsession isn't the one that wants power, it's the one that believes it deserves it. I'm Bobby Garrison, this is Dark Margins, and I'll see you in the next chapter.